So yeah, my name is Dan Bujak. Right now, I am in the Bay Area working at Amazon at Lab 126 as a firmware engineer. And yeah, Dan and I have worked together in the past and been known Josh for a while as well. And they asked me to come on and tell you guys a little bit about myself. So yeah, I took mechatronics at McMaster, which was a fairly new program at the time, but I think it's a lot more popular nowadays. But yeah, it's a mix of EE, software, mechanical, so it's nice broad education and sets you up decently well for having a good broad view of engineering in general. But on the other end, it's not quite as good as preparing you for any one particular stream. But yeah, I had a fairly standard school experience. There was one good thing about the mechatronics program was that it gave you a lot of choice for co-ops. So I think co-ops is a very important part of school, probably the most valuable part of it actually. But yeah, when I was applying for co-ops, I had choice between like mechanical engineering for like an injection molding company, all the way to pure software and kind of everything in between because of that broad nature of that program. So that was kind of nice. But yeah, I ended up doing a 16-month internship between my third and fourth year. That was nice and refreshing. I was starting to get a little bit tired of school at that point, and it was nice to take a step back and recharge, and kind of gave me a chance to enjoy my fourth year a little bit more. So I highly recommend doing that as well if you're kind of in a similar boat as me and maybe not liking or getting a little bit tired of it. However, the one thing I would say about that is the 16-month internship I think was a mistake. I think it's definitely better to do smaller chunks. I know like Waterloo, for example, kind of enforces that with their semester structure, but even if you end up taking the whole year off, I would highly recommend splitting that into smaller 4-month chunks, or even like an 8-month and 2 4 months or something like that, just to try to get as broad an experience with co-ops as possible. I think what happened with me and what can happen with a lot of people that I've talked to in similar kind of situations is that you get stuck in this one role and maybe they only have so much work for you, or they kind of have the scope of what you're doing and maybe you figured it out in 4 months, and then the remaining 12 months you're kind of just churning and doing the same thing. So it's definitely beneficial to get a few different experiences and use that to kind of guide your steps after school as well. But yeah, I think that was probably the most noteworthy part of my schooling was the co-op. It was a nice intro into the working world, and gave me some perspective at least into what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. So at the end of school, I decided not to do any kind of grad school. I was thinking about that for a while, but I had an offer actually from that co-op to go back full-time after I was done. So decided not to do any grad school and just went straight into the workforce. After the fourth year, I went back to that same company. But yeah, that was pretty much my whole school experience. Sure.
Just because we've talked about school experiences with a couple of people so far, and I like to get a sense of kind of beyond just what you actually did that can be recorded on paper. Like, where was your head around then? Like, what were you thinking about? Did you kind of have a direction in mind as you were going through your education, or were you just taking the opportunities as they came up?
My head was probably the same place that a lot of 19, 20-year-olds heads are. I think I was not as focused on school side as I probably could have been. So I think I missed out on maybe taking some opportunities that were available. Like, I think, people always say to get involved with your school and extracurriculars and all that, which I think I could have capitalized on a little bit more. But I think more to your point in terms of like taking opportunities, if I had like a fixed direction, I don't think I really have that. I think I've always kind of biased more towards being a generalist and kind of taking opportunities as they come. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But I think that, again, that's, can be good and bad. It gives you opportunities and makes you more adaptable, but it also probably would have helped to have a little bit more direction and actually have a goal to go towards. But again, that's hard to do when you're, in school and you don't have a lot of experiences and you don't really know what you like or what you don't like. So I think co-op, again, is key in that. If you can do 3 or 4 placements, that certainly gives you a much better understanding of what you actually want to do and gives you the ability to kind of drive towards that rather than just taking whatever falls into your lap.
Yeah, do you have any suggestions for people that maybe are not part of a co-op program? Because I mean, I think we all probably agree that co-op is a huge value, but I think there's a lot of people out there as well that don't have that kind of opportunity. So like, what would you recommend to them to give them the same kind of opportunity?
For sure, yeah. Like you say, not all schools require co-op. I feel like most schools you can do co-op, even if it's not required. Like definitely try to do that. I think co-op's becoming more popular as well, and so it's much more, companies have heard of it and are much more willing to take on students in that kind of capacity. But that said, I would say you can still work at a company even if it's not labeled like, quote unquote co-op, and still get relevant experience. So I think that's something that definitely has value. And one of my first work terms wasn't a co-op, but it's still, I did some relevant work and it was still a valuable experience. Barring that, there's always projects. I mean, it depends on what kind of field you're in. It's a lot harder to, tinker if you're a civil engineer, but if you're in software, like do a project. If you don't have like concrete work experience, that's the number one thing I look for in like a new grad when I'm hiring is, have they done a project? Have they shown that they're interested in this kind of thing, or that they can take the initiative to do something on their own and have something to show at the end of it, have some lessons learned from it or something like that. So yeah, I think those are probably the two most important things.
I think we'll come back to the projects and some of the other things you're up to, but something I wanted to get into before we let you get deeper into your employment history is a question for kind of new graduates and people coming out of school. You mentioned mechatronics kind of being a combination of different kinds of engineering or giving you different exposures. Is there a hiring differential kind of in the market right now? Or are there some engineering skills that are valued a little differently than they might have been 5 years ago? What have you kind of seen in your time out there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think programs like mechatronics have gained in popularity. And so if nothing else, you see more applicants with that on their resume, whereas like my second year was the first graduating class of mechatronics. So it wasn't even an accredited program until my second year of school. So I mean, at that time, a lot of employers actually weren't really sure what that program meant. So I was doing a lot of explaining of what that was in my interviews. I think to answer your question, I think that varies a lot based on the role you're hiring for. So I wouldn't say there's one specific area that's more popular or, more valuable. I think it obviously depends on the role. Like if we're hiring for a similar role to what I'm doing, where there's, embedded systems and you're integrating just some sort of mechanical system maybe, and you have these multiple disciplines coming together, then something like a mechatronics background would be more valuable, and we would kind of target at those kinds of students. And you often find that people who are interested in doing that kind of work would also kind of gravitate towards those kinds of degrees. Whereas, I mean, if you're doing pure software development work, a mechatronics student probably isn't the right person to hire. You probably want someone who's hardcore into the software and that's all they've done, and they're really deep into it and understand it well, but they don't have the EE background, for example, but it's not as relevant there either. So
cool. Okay, then why don't we get into the positions that kind of led you up to what you were doing now? Because we've already had a question come in from the audience just asking, where have you worked and how would you describe your jobs at those places?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to give you guys the Coles notes or the highlights. So yeah, I mean, as I said, I had that internship. They gave me a full-time offer to come back, so I just jumped on that to avoid the stresses of finding a job in a new place to move and all that while still doing school. So that was kind of nice, and I appreciated that opportunity. So I went back there. It ended up being a not particularly noteworthy job aside from getting laid off like 6 months into starting. So that was a bit of a rude wake-up call to the realities of the working world. I was I still had student debt, just signed a lease, and now I'm losing my job. I think that kind of tainted my view going forward a little bit. With anytime companies talked about cost cutting, I was like, oh no, definitely getting laid off. But yeah, so I mean, the one thing that was really nice is they gave us, I think, probably like 4 months of notice before they shut the office down. And I mean, we obviously weren't being super productive at that point. So it was that 4 months kind of gave me this chance to do that job hunt that I would have liked to do ideally, I think, at the end of school, but chose not to in the interest of safety, I guess. But yeah, so I ended up looking for a job, found something in Waterloo. That's when I moved to the Waterloo area. I figured it made sense to move, since that's kind of where all the jobs were that I was finding, or like even all the opportunities I was finding were all in that Waterloo region. So that took me to On Semiconductor, which, if you guys are familiar, it's a pretty big semiconductor company, but I was working for a very small business unit of actually making hearing aids. So I think the office was something like 40 people maybe, so very small compared to like the 10,000 employees they had worldwide. So I think that was my first actual like proper role that lasted more than 6 months anyway. But it was I think a pivotal role as well, because I was lucky enough to have a really good manager there, and this kind of, I think, kickstarted my whole career and dictated the direction of it. He kind of took me under his wing and mentored me, which I think incidentally is a very important thing as well. I always recommend people to find a mentor, but I can talk about that a little bit later. But it can really accelerate you down the right path. You know, having someone with experience who's maybe been where you are, tell you something, versus you taking the next 5 years of experiences and trials to figure that out, can definitely accelerate you. But anyway, I think the main impact that he had on me was, I remember this time he actually sat me down. We talked about like breadth versus depth and specializing versus being a generalist. And like, as I mentioned, this is always something that I kind of kept coming back to. It's like, no, I'm a generalist, I like to do everything. And he told me like, that's great, and you definitely need that, especially in this kind of role where you're dealing with multiple systems and integrating things. But without having a specialization or going deep into one area, you're just not going to have the kind of value that companies are looking for, especially later on in your career. It's not so much an issue when you're a junior or first couple of years out of school, but like if you apply for a role later on, no one's really looking for a generalist. Like, there's some unique applications to that. If you're maybe at a startup, you need to do a lot of roles, it's great to have that, but generally people are looking for, we need to fill this position, someone needs to do this kind of work, and we're looking for someone who has experience in that role. So anyway, that's kind of the moral of what he was telling me, and it took a while for that to click with me, but I think it was definitely very valuable advice. And he was nice enough to, over the next year, give me multiple roles, or like multiple smaller projects that allowed me to kind of explore those different options. So I did like some schematic and PCB design and some test engineering and like audio testing, because it's an audio company, and then finally some firmware as well. And the firmware was one that I think resonated with me more and kind of led me down that path. So after that, we started working more on firmware projects, and that's kind of what I did for the rest of my time at onsemi. And then around the 3-year mark there, I decided to start branching out and maybe look for new opportunities. I heard that Arion, a local drone company that I wanted to work at in the past, was hiring, so I applied there and then ended up going there for work, which was an interesting role because I was doing controls firmware there. So this was my first like dedicated firmware role. The previous one was kind of a systems engineer, but doing more firmware. This one was actually like dedicated firmware, but it was also very heavy in the math. So I was doing gimbal pointing, so stabilizing a camera on a drone and pointing it to the right place on the earth relative to the drone's body's orientation and all that. So I had to go back and relearn a lot of the algebra and matrix math and all that stuff that I learned at school and was convinced I was never going to use again. So
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of like, when are you going to ever use this matrix rotation? Yeah, well, there you go. But yeah, so that was kind of interesting because it was very much math heavy and a very different side to firmware development. It was almost like integrating or implementing algorithms rather than focusing on firmware development. And it's also the first company I worked at that was actually had like a structured software development process. onsemi was a big company, but it was we kind of flew by the seat of our pants. There was no real structure around how you organized your code or where you put it and that kind of stuff. So that was a good learning opportunity there. But I was only there just over a year before opportunity came knocking in the form of Dan here, who introduced me to Swift Labs, and he sold me on it as like this up and coming startup. It was all exciting. And it was actually, it's a lot of fun to work at. So yeah, that is to say that after a year and a half or so, I ended up joining Swift Labs, who maybe Dan's told you guys about them a little bit, but we did design services in the IoT space. So you know, consulting basically for customers who needed products built and didn't have the engineering resources, or you know, they were lacking in a certain area that they expertise on, mostly around wireless technology and wireless designs. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, that company, and it was kind of my first real introduction, I'd say, into the consulting world, which is great because you get exposure to a lot of different companies and a lot of different technologies. And this kind of comes back to that dichotomy of breadth versus depth. I think with consulting, you get tons of exposure and tons of experience. Every customer is different industry, different product, different technology. Like we can go from a medical product one day to some sort of like agricultural, you know, tracking device. So it's got a huge range, but at the same time, you don't really ever get into that depth. So you don't really become an expert at one thing. I think one possible caveat to that is if you went into like a very specific consulting. So like if we did design services for the medical field, then you'd probably get a little bit more of that. But again, you'd be trading off some of the variety. But yeah, I find that with the design services, like if we had, for example, a medical client, we probably wouldn't get involved with like the medical side of the certifications, for example. They would handle that because they're the experts in that. So you don't really get deep into any one area. But at the same time, I mean, it's a ton of fun to work with all these different companies and see, you know, how those industries operate and what's important to them, what their requirements are. And it varies quite a bit actually across those different industries. Yeah, the other thing about the consulting world is that it's very cyclic in nature. So like the work ebbs and flows, and that's always difficult to manage. You know, you can get 3 clients in 1 week and then nothing for a month, and that's a challenge, especially with small companies. So I think that uncertainty and kind of chaotic nature of that was a little bit, can wear a little bit more on you than being at a more stable role. So I think that's something important to consider as well. If you're the type of person who needs stability and needs to know exactly, you know, what they're working on next and what's going to happen, then it's may not be the right choice. But it is a great opportunity to learn new things, and you're kind of thrown into the deep end and have to figure things out as you go. So I think it was really interesting for that.
So before we go down maybe further the consulting route, just wanted to jump in with a question, because I think one of the things I think a lot of people struggle with in terms of that generalization, specialization concept is like, is it critical to make that decision at a certain point, or does it really matter? If you're starting off as a generalist, should you just go down that path until you find an opportunity, or like what do you recommend there? At what point do you really need to try and make that decision?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think I would bring that back to the whole mentorship side of things. I think that answer is going to depend or vary based on the industry and type of work you're in. So that's somewhere where you could really lean on someone who's more senior in your team and has gone through that, and, you know, kind of establish that relationship with them and ask them what they think. Like, I think that would vary across industries. I don't think anywhere you really have to make that specialization very early on. I think one thing that does make that decision for you kind of is going into grad school or you know, a master's and PhD. That is one version of that specialization. So at that point, you're kind of committing to, I'm going to, you know, dedicate some time to this area. So that is one version of that. But I think when you first graduate, everyone kind of expects you to get your footing and figure things out. And as a junior, you're not expected to have that kind of depth. So, I mean, to give an answer, I'd say certainly not. That's not expected in the first couple of years of working. But I think even in those first couple of years, it's worth starting to think about. And yeah, I think having a mentor to help guide you through that is probably the most efficient way of doing that.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, maybe we can jump back to your consulting gig there.
Sure.
So, I mean, I think it's an interesting pathway that you've taken to get there, because you kind of went general, specialized, back to general, and now you're going back to specialized again. Is that like how you kind of think of it, or what?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about that. I guess that's true. Yeah. I mean, I like to change things up. I think everyone likes to get some variety. So maybe that's just it happens subconsciously of, I've been doing general things for a while. Now let's try to get back deep into something else. So maybe that's where that came from. But no, it wasn't a conscious decision of let's go back to something specific.
I do want to draw out one of those specializations a little bit, because we have a question about just, can you explain what firmware is, and is it kind of an intersection between software and hardware? Like how would you explain that?
Yeah, I should have probably touched on that. That's a big point of contention in a lot of places. It's funny, different companies you go to have different ideas of what firmware versus software is, depending on where they operate and where their normal is. So it's almost like a relative term, like compared to like, web development, anything's firmware basically. But a lot of companies we work at, firmware kind of refers to writing code for embedded devices, broadly speaking. So microcontrollers, sometimes Linux development, like an embedded Linux development, would also be considered firmware. That's kind of one of those areas where the contention comes up of, if you're doing both of those things, you're doing microcontrollers and low-level firmware, and you're doing embedded Linux and writing firmware there, then the Linux development becomes software, and the microcontrollers are the firmware. I mean, you can also go even lower, but generally, firmware, when I say that, I refer to writing code for embedded platforms.
And do you appreciate the hardware experience that you got from the mechatronics program as kind of contributing to that transition into firmware?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the fundamentals, like the EE fundamentals and understanding circuits, and having done a little bit of PCB design myself, I guess that wasn't in school, but that was kind of part of some projects I did during school, and that it was kind of enabled by that program. I think that's very valuable. Even now, if I get a board and I'm debugging my software or my firmware, having that understanding of how electrical signals work, and seeing a voltage divider or a MOSFET on a schematic and knowing what that is, I think that's very valuable. Not having to go to the EE team and say, "Oh, what is this? Can you help me understand it?" I'm by no means an expert, but having enough to know your way around a schematic, I think is very valuable. The mechanical side, I would say not so much. I didn't really learn anything in school on the mechanical side that I can actually apply to my work. I think the biggest thing I learned was some better skills in like 3D CAD modeling and those kinds of tools. So if I'm building prototypes, I can, make my way around like SketchUp or Inventor or something to model a little case or some sort of mechanical contraption that I can print. But yeah, I think the EE was definitely valuable.
Yeah, so maybe you can jump back to the consulting kind of piece there, because
Sure.
I mean, I think you have a whole bunch of different experiences, like just beyond even like Swift Labs, kind of on your own side too. I think maybe people would be interested in hearing about that, how you got into it.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I was just finishing up with Swift Labs, and I think I pretty much talked about everything I wanted to talk about there. But during these last, I don't know, the experience I just listed off spanned probably 6-7 years. In that period, I also did a couple of smaller consulting jobs on the side. The first one was at a company called Lenano. They do point of care medical diagnostic devices. And I got introduced to them through a colleague from onsemi, actually, who had been doing some work with them, but didn't have time anymore. And he asked me if I'd be interested in those. I hadn't really thought about it at all at that time, but I figured why not go for it and see how it goes. So I ended up working with them quite a bit. They didn't have any technical staff, so I was doing like project management and gathering requirements, and went through like the full product development process with them. I ended up building their the first two generations of their prototype. So the first one was just an EVK. I built a separate board that plugged into it and kind of gave them some different interfaces to talk through. And then the second one was actually integrating all together into more form factor and letting do a lot of their testing. They were actually located at the University of Waterloo, so that was kind of nice because I could just swing by their labs and we could work together. But that was my first like actual consulting gig, I'd say. It was definitely rewarding, having that ownership and being able to see that full process through versus is very different to compared to, you know, working at a company and you're given a task to develop this firmware and the behind the scenes of why we're working on this project or where it came from or why this task, and a lot of that is distracted away from you, so you don't really get exposed to that. But here it's, you know, it's straight from the customer's requirements. If we want to, not even the requirements, their problem, like we want to solve this problem, this is what we can't do, how do we do it, and taking that all the way from that level of infancy through to here is your prototype that does that for you. I think that was very rewarding. It's also a big challenge, I'd say, especially I think I was pretty early on in my career still when I did that, and I think it's that makes it a little bit more difficult because you don't have that depth of experience necessarily, and when you're consulting, you're on your own. You can't really, you know, turn to the senior guy on your team and say, I don't know how to do this, can you help me? So that even at that point, I was kind of reaching out to a few of my closer colleagues saying, you know, I'm working on this project and this is kind of running into this issue, can you guys maybe help me with it? But that's a much tougher sell than, you know, when you're all working at a company and on a project that you don't want to bug people either. So but yeah, it was definitely a lot of learning, and I found that it was quite surprising to me how much I could get done when I sat down and had like a focused chunk of time on my own schedule, kind of, rather than, you know, being in the office and having all the distractions around, and maybe when I'm not in the right mind frame. So like, well, I did a lot of my work in the evenings for that, and I found that having like a 5-hour chunk of time in the evening, I could get a lot of work done, which was interesting. It was kind of enlightening to the amount of, I think, distractions that are kind of inherent in an office setting. But yeah, so that was the first one, and then the second main contract work I did was with another consulting company, I guess. I did a little bit of consulting for them for their consulting clients. So I guess they kind of outsourced their work to me. But they ended up starting another company that I was working for more, I guess, in a more full-time, part-time capacity, like 20 hours a week. And that company is called Toxon, and they make like sport technology devices for archery. So it's like a little IoT type device that you strap to your bow, and it tracks your shots and helps you train and improve your shot. So I worked with those guys for 2 years, built again their first 2 prototypes, was involved a lot with the development of their actual product, which is out in the market now. So yeah, that was, I think, a lot of similar types of takeaways from that as the first one, but by that point I had a lot more experience and was a lot deeper into the firmware. So I was, I think, able to be more confident in what I could do and how to do things. So it was nice to not have to, like, I think with the first job, I was second guessing myself a lot and not sure if I was doing the right things, or, you know, if there's a better way to do this, or if I was going to get laughed out of the office when I showed them my work. So it was nice to have that confidence and go there and, you know, be able to tell them this is the right way to do this, and actually executing on that. So yeah, that was good experience. It was, I would say, a little bit more stressful because it's a big time commitment. So that's one of the things with doing these side gigs, is it can definitely get stressful when you're, you know, doing full-time work and maybe deadlines are starting to slip at work and you're having to put in extra hours there, but you also come home to knowing that you have other work as well, and starts eating into your weekend. So that becomes a bit of a challenge, but overall I think it's valuable, and I did enjoy doing it.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in on that point there because every time I think about somebody who hustles, I generally think about you, because you always seem to have 10 different things on the go all at once. And I mean, I think it'd be interesting for people to hear, like, what is your mindset about that? Like, how do you strategize being able to handle so many things in parallel at the same time?
Yeah, it's not easy, that's for sure. And I think that's something that I've been learning as I go as well. I think compartmentalization is important, and that's pretty difficult to do right now with the whole work from home situation. So I think I've been kind of relapsing with that, I've noticed. But yeah, I think probably compartmentalization is the biggest tool that I used, like having set times of, you know, I'm going to dedicate these next 4 hours to doing this, and not only that, but actually making sure you're focused on that work at that time. So, you know, that's kind of like put your phone away, have no distractions, and focus in on that one task. Because as I mentioned earlier, like, I was amazed at how much I could get done when I had that kind of 4 or 5 hour chunk of time available. You can actually get a lot done. But if that 4 or 5 hour chunk of time is filled with just distractions and, oh, we just go grab a snack and we just answer this message, then that kind of ruins that flow. So I think that was important, and also setting kind of limits to what you're going to do. So, saying if I'm dedicating 40 hours a week to this, or 20 hours a week to that, or 10 to this, making sure you're within reason sticking to that, and not just spending every hour working on it, which is hard to do. And it's even harder to kind of turn off your brain after let's say you're done working on that, you're going to like your relaxed time now, but you're still kind of churning in the back of your mind. So trying to switch that off can be difficult, but I think those things are important for maintaining your sanity and maintaining times where you can actually do the things that you want to do and are important to you at the time. But yeah, I think compartmentalization, prioritization. Yeah, actually prioritization is a big one too. Like deciding what's worth spending your time on. Like if you get a consulting job and it's not paying very much and it's a lot of stress, maybe you don't take it and just turn that one down. So it's important to decide where you spend your time too, because especially as you get older, seems to have less and less of it.
So I feel pretty redundant now, because my next question was going to be about how proactive you are and busy and stuff. And but I wanted to ask, just asking from like an external, like non-engineer perspective. I know we bring people into our kind of project team now, and we throw a bunch of software at them, and we say we're going to be using all the software to like plan our projects out, but we never sit down and have like a formal project management like education period. Is that already embedded into the engineering education, or is that a skill that engineers can kind of develop afterwards that might be helpful?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So you're saying you give these engineers some sort of project to do at a high level, or like what kind of work are you giving to them?
No, yeah, I'm not even talking about engineers. I'm just talking about people that are coming from production, for example, to now work on projects. And just like you mentioned with at Swift, like the project timing can be all clumped at one time. It can be like sparse at another time. So your organization is really important, but we don't really explicitly teach organization skills. We just say, here's a bunch of useful tools, adapt, and you'll get better at it over time. But I'm wondering if there's an easier way to do that.
Yeah, that's I think that's probably one area where school actually is valuable, because a lot of those time management and prioritization skills, I think you kind of have to develop while you're there, and figure out when things are due in terms of tests and assignments and that kind of thing. So you tend to develop those skills, and I kind of think it's a bit of a based on survival of the fittest kind of thing. Like if you can't organize your time, or you can't manage your time effectively, you're probably not going to get to the position where people are just giving you work with that kind of freedom. That you're going to end up in positions where you're in a much more structured role, which there's nothing wrong with. A lot of people thrive in that kind of setting of like take work in one side, put product out the other side, and that's just what they do. And they really enjoy being kind of siloed. But I think in those situations where people are just have a bunch of work dumped on them and left to their own devices to figure out, they either have the skills or they don't. I mean, obviously you can develop those skills. It's not saying you can't learn them, but it's kind of, I think, on those individuals to develop those skills in themselves and figure it out. If they don't have those skills, then they're going to find themselves struggling in those kinds of situations. Yeah, to answer your question, I don't think it's on the employer to teach those people how to manage their time.
All right, yeah, and then I think it would probably be good just to talk about your Amazon experience, and just kind of dig into that a little bit, and then maybe we'll open it up for questions, because I'm sure there's some people out there that have specific questions that might help relate it more specifically to their situation.
Sure, yeah. I guess we left off with Swift Labs. So I was doing that consulting there for, like I said, for a while, and was enjoying that variety. But I think similar to kind of some of my other roles, I got to that 3-year mark or so where I start to find that I get a little bit antsy, and maybe I'm not learning as many new things, or maybe I'm just getting tired of the nature of the work, and to Dan's point, switching over to something on the opposite end of the spectrum again. And then that's kind of aligned with when COVID actually started. So we were working from home at that time, and maybe a little bit disconnected from the team and less like actively involved and aligned with the goals. So that kind of pushed me towards looking for other things as well. And at that point, I decided to start applying for a few jobs, and my plan was to kind of apply for the top tier of companies and only positions that I thought I would really enjoy. I guess that's one nice thing about once you've had those specializations and you're a little bit further along in your career and you're in a job that you don't mind and you're perfectly fine doing, you can have the luxury of taking 3-6 months to find a job. There's no rush, so that's kind of a nice opportunity for me as well to just cherry pick the jobs that sounded the most interesting to me and applying to those. But actually, Amazon was one of the first jobs I applied to, and I guess it went pretty well. I ended up getting that job, and the plan was kind of to maybe rely on COVID to work remotely for a while, but Amazon kind of pushed for co-locating everyone, and I knew I was going to have to relocate eventually anyway, which incidentally would have been right around now, so a year after I moved pretty much. But I decided to just jump in and bite the bullet early on and move. So I ended up relocating to the Bay Area, which is kind of something that I've been wanting to do, or at least considering for a while. It is kind of like obviously the mecca for software, so it's definitely an experience. But yeah, so I've been here for, I don't know, 6 months now, 8 months, working at Lab 126. They're the group that makes the Echo devices. Got one right here. I was told I could promote my product. Yeah, so that's our latest product. But it's anything with like Echo devices, so Alexa built in. I was probably gonna pick that up. But the typical consumer-facing products that you guys know from Amazon, those are the kinds of things that we're working on. Yeah, so this role is actually kind of similar to some roles I've done in the past. It's a little bit more integrated and going deep into firmware and devices. So it's been interesting. But yeah, I think I don't have too much to say about that role yet. I've only been there for 8 months.
Yeah, maybe you can tell us just quickly about like the interview process, like how intense was it? Because I haven't really shared that with too many of the people here, but the Apple interview experience is like quite intense. Is Amazon similar in that respect?
Yeah, I would say it's rigorous rather than intense. Like, I think that was my view of it as well prior to having started here. Since starting here, I've actually been on the other side of the table and involved with hiring and interviewing. So I've seen a lot of the behind the scenes and how the interview process works. And to Amazon's credit, I think it's a very well structured and data driven process, which to me, I think that translates to being a fair process as well. It's not like, people are asking trick questions or trying to catch you out, but we're also doing everything we can to get as much information from candidates as possible in a very short amount of time, so that can feel, very rushed and overwhelming from the other side of the table, which obviously I went through as well. But yeah, I think it's as far as processes go, it's fairly in line with other big tech companies. Certainly more rigorous than other smaller companies that I've interviewed at. Like some companies, it's a half-hour sit down, let's just chat and get to know each other. Some companies, there's a lot of like hardcore, just whiteboard coding. I think Amazon's process is split across the two, and they focus a lot on their leadership principles and also getting like the tech background. So it is definitely a rigorous process, but at the end of the day, I think if you prepare, you can actually do a lot to prepare for interviews. I think a lot of people feel like, it's just whether you know it or you don't, or if you get caught out by a question, too bad, unlucky for you. But I think there's a lot you can actually prepare for interviews. Think about scenarios that you've had in your career and different lessons you've learned, and having these kinds of stories prepared, I think is very important. So if someone asks you a question of, tell me about a time this happened, or give me an example of how you would deal with the situation, you can have these stories in the back of your head of like, oh yeah, this kind of applies to that. Let me tell that story. We can talk about it. Or even on the technical side, a lot of times these questions are kind of like, you either get it or you don't, or if you don't get the crux of the question, it's very difficult to solve. But if you can show that you were working through the process and you're thinking about things and working through it step by step, I think that adds a lot of value to when interviewers see that too. So there's definitely value in interviewing, and it's definitely possible in preparing, and it's definitely possible to prepare for interviews. kind
I
of
really like
roundabout
that
answer.
point. Yeah, no, because it's such an art. It's almost like verbally writing a resume, right? Being able to say in a concise and informative way, like, this was my contribution, this is what I took from it. And I spent a lot of time early in my career just saying, well, I do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and like blah blah blah. And I realized a few years later how bad that sounded. Like, it was so like not to the point and not delivering a message. So I definitely agree with you that preparation is something you can do.
Yeah, I think that comes with experience too, right? Like when you're starting out, that's kind of how you feel. Like, yeah, I did a little bit of this, I contributed on this, but when you start taking on, I guess, more individual or independent senior roles, and you can feel like you have that contribution, you can actually talk about it.
Yeah, do you have any preparation strategy advice for people? Because I think that, like, one of the things I suggest is to, at the very least, like, really know your resume inside out. Because I mean, even as an interviewer, some of the strategies we use sometimes, because we don't have a lot of, sometimes the person themselves has more information about that topic than we do, but our process is, okay, let's dig into that and keep digging until something breaks, right?
Exactly.
But like, is that the kind of strategy you would tell people to focus on, or like, do you have other ideas of how to prepare for these kinds of situations?
So yeah, I think to your point, obviously know your resume. Like if you're going to put on your resume, be prepared to talk about it. That's nothing worse than I ask someone about their resume and they're like, oh, I don't really know, or like, I can't remember, or, you know, like if you can't remember, you can't talk about it, don't put it on there. Or if it's on there, then like, you know, think back, look through your notes, figure out what you did, and rebuild that experience or that memory. But I think really interviewing, you can break into two different sections. One is kind of that behavioral side of soft skills questions, and then not necessarily soft skills, it could still be technical, but more on like the, you know, experience and talking about how you solve problems and that kind of stuff. And then there's a technical side, and like the whiteboard coding and, you know, problem solving interviews. So I think that side's more specific to software type roles. I don't think that's as prevalent in other disciplines. So I mean, I won't talk too much about that because there's tons of resources available online on how to prepare for like these, you know, lead code questions and all that. But on the behavioral side or the problem solving side, I think the biggest thing I would recommend is having these situations prepared, or like the stories, or yeah, I think stories is the best way to put them. Like create a narrative around what you did. That, to Josh's point, includes what your contribution was, what the value was from that, what you learned from that, what you would do differently. Like these are the kinds of questions that I tend to ask of, you know, tell me about when you had a difficult problem and how you solved it. And like, you shouldn't have to sit there thinking like, oh, like when did I have a difficult problem like that? Everyone's had difficult problems, they've solved them. So like, do the amount of preparation that's necessary to have that ready in the back of your head. Okay, it's like problem question. Yeah, here's I have 3 problem questions. This is probably the best one to bring up for this, and then be able to talk about it, tell that story, tell them what the situation was, like how it came up, who cared about this problem, how you solved it, what you learned from it. Like follow-up questions are always like, you know, what would you have done differently? Or like if you raise a problem and someone says like, why was that problem? Or like what worked well, what didn't? You should have these answers. So I think the biggest thing I would recommend is having these stories prepared and having a good narrative around what happened and why. I'm not saying embellish or like make things up, but, you know, pull out the details that are important or that people would find interesting and have them ready.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Dan's point about kind of digging into one part until it breaks too. And just, I think we mentioned this in our first episode on networking and interviewing, but like not being super anxious about where that point is. Like you're going to hit a point where they're going to be asking you about something and you're not going to know the answer, and that's okay. Like they're not hiring you to be CEO. Like maybe not yet, but I can't speak to you guys. But yeah, like I think that your preparation steps are really on point, and that's a really great thing to take away from this.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's absolutely valid. At some point, you can say, yeah, you know, like we never took it that deep, or we never ended up exploring that option because this worked and whatever. But you should still have a reason why you didn't go there, for example, right? So like this solution worked, that was sufficient to get us going, so we didn't end up exploring that side of things. But you know, just saying I don't know, or like early on in the process, the first follow-up question you're saying I don't know to them, that's probably a bigger problem.
So what has been your experience working for like smaller companies versus Amazon, which everyone knows is like one of the major ones? Like I understand, like, again, you were doing a lot of the same work in terms of firmware, and I'm just curious because like I'm working for a startup right now, but I'm really interested in kind of hearing the other side of it. Any thoughts
Sure.
on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because there can be a lot of similarities and a lot of differences as well, varying from company to company. I think in general, the smaller companies, you end up wearing more hats and being responsible for more tasks, and the breadth of those or the scope of those tasks is oftentimes larger. So like by nature of being a smaller company, they don't have as many resources to dedicate to projects. So people obviously end up spanning more roles than they would at a larger company. That said, a lot of larger companies are also structured in such a way that they have these kind of small subgroups where you can also encounter that kind of role. I think, for example, like Onsemi was a huge company, but I was in a very small business unit, so it had kind of those startup-y vibes to it. I think when people think of big company, they picture someone very siloed and being one small cog in a big machine. And I think that definitely can happen. I think I've been fortunate enough to avoid that role. I guess fortunate for me because I don't think I would thrive in that kind of role. But again, there's some people who enjoy that. So I think it's largely like the role itself is just as important as the company. Like every company has roles that are more structured and more siloed, and roles that are more broad. But generally speaking, I think that's kind of what you can expect is if you're at a large company with a large team, you're going to feel like a much smaller part of that big team, and you're going to feel like your contributions might not be as big of a part. But then at the same time, you also get to go very deep into that one subject. So I mean, that tends to happen with people who are extremely specialized in very like niche areas. So like like audio and wireless communications and digital design, like ASIC design, those are things that are becoming smaller and smaller and becoming more and more centralized at certain companies. So I think that's that classic idea of small versus big. But again, there's a lot of variation. Like I think my role right now at Amazon, I don't feel like a small cog in a big machine. Like our team's small, and our contributions definitely are still on that same kind of level as they would be at a startup. The one thing that's nice about big companies is resources. So I never have to worry about ordering that power supply that I need or like expensing that. So that's one thing to consider as well.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I know right now, like working at a startup, they're always like telling me to learn something new, and I don't mind it. I really like it. But what I'm understanding is that in smaller companies, it's more like the breadth that you're learning so much of. But then, and in larger companies, like you're still constantly learning. It's just really specialized, right? Like, is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment, and actually that's a good point. Like if you're a small company and you're being asked to learn a lot, one thing that can become a challenge with that is if you don't have someone on your team that knows how to do that and you're the only one who's able to do it or figure it out on their own, that becomes a lot more difficult. Like for example, at a larger company, typically you have someone who knows how to do the thing that you're trying to figure out, so you can go to that person and just ask for a little bit of advice or some guidance. So I think that's actually one of the downsides of the smaller companies is that you don't have that same kind of support system. Like if you're one of 3 engineers and one's more junior than you and one's at the same level, you don't really have anyone to look to help you figure out those kinds of things. But yeah, I think generally your assessment's correct.
Okay, awesome, thanks. And I actually had one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
You talked about like the importance of mentorship and like finding mentors, and actually like I'm just finishing my first year at Mac actually, and I'm like doing everything online, and I don't really have those mentors. And I was wondering, like, do you have any ideas of like how you could find people that would kind of get you involved in that way, or like kind of show you the ropes? I know it's a little bit different online, or do you kind of just recommend getting into the workforce first, and that's where?
Yeah, that's a tough situation to be in. I think finding a mentor in that position when you're still early on in your education is difficult. And I think that's something I mentioned this a little bit about how I missed out on that in school and didn't really get as involved as I think I could have. I think that's part of it is getting involved in you know, even with your professors, I mean, your professors are a great resource for that. You can ask them. A lot of them are actually people who have worked in industry before, so they may be good mentors. But also getting involved with different clubs and different groups, or even like forums that are doing the kinds of things that you enjoy doing. Oftentimes there will be people there who have been in your shoes and are currently doing what you aspire to do. So they've been through that transition and can be a good resource to ask for advice from. Yeah, I think if you have an interest or you know what you want to do, then that's a big part of that process, because then you know where you can look. And like, for example, I mentioned forums. Like if you have some niche area that you're interested in, then maybe pursuing that kind of community and getting involved with those people.
Thanks. And yeah, I think that kind of leads into like one of the questions that I was just going to tag on there as well, just in terms of networking, because I think mentorship is a huge piece. And as Lydia was kind of asking, like, how do you get involved with that? And I think kind of the tie-in I wanted to make there was how important do you think networking is for, I mean, I guess your career path, how you've taken the steps that you have in terms of either getting jobs or just building your network. Like, where do you think people should be focusing their efforts on that?
Yeah, that's network is kind of a tricky one, I think. Well, I think it has a lot of negative connotations with some people who maybe don't understand like the tangible value from networking and building those relationships, or don't feel it's fair that, you know, a lot of decisions are made based on networking. But I think for me anyway, networking is it's not about nepotism as some people seem to think, but more about earning trust and demonstrating to people that, you know, you're someone who they can rely on when things get stressful or difficult, and you're able to handle yourself, not just your work, but handle yourself around other people. You're not going to be the person to, you know, throw a chair across the meeting room and storm out because something's gone wrong. But yeah, so I think a big part of that is having that trust built with people, and having them be able to say, you know, I've worked with so and so, and I remember like they were always willing to help out, or when things got difficult, they kept their heads down and they kept their cool and they were able to pull through. So I think that's one big part of it. The other part of it is just almost logistical, in the sense that the more people you know, the more you're going to expose yourself to them, the more you're going to be on their mind. And so when they're hiring, you know, the first thing that everyone's going to do is think about, who do I know that might be fit for this role? And like, that's just, I think, a natural way of just like thought process for humans, right? You know, what have I done in the past, or what experience do I have that relates to this, and how can I make use of that? So with hiring, that's who have I worked with, or who can I reach out to? So I think part of it is also just that logistical side of being at the forefront of someone's mind, being at the right place at the right time kind of thing. If someone is looking for, you know, from a resource for a consulting job, and they think, oh, yeah, Dan's done something like that in the past, let me ask him. And maybe I can't do it, but maybe I know someone who can. So I think that's a big part of it as well. And it's just not about, you know, befriending everyone and being best buds, but it's about just meeting people and having them know who you are and what you do, and building a little bit of that trust.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing you can do is obviously take my DTFC networking course. Shameless plug.
I'll allow it. I promoted my product too.
I sense a bit of shame. I don't know if that was completely shameless.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Any other? So Sanana has a question here. I think it's more specifically to. So I'll just read it out. Do you see an increase in application of AI starting to affect bigger companies like Apple and Amazon in the job recruitment process? If so, how are they changing it?
Yeah, good question. I don't think I'm deeply involved in the recruitment process enough to know that. I think it's kind of inevitable to some extent, because, like I said, Amazon's recruitment process, which is just the one I'm familiar with, but it is very data driven, and I know there's a lot of resources dedicated to making sure that our recruitment process is as good as possible and the customer experience is good. And, you know, there's a lot of collecting feedback and data processing essentially that goes into that. So I mean, if there's any opportunity to outsource that, so to speak, to AI, I think it will happen, but probably not entirely, there'll always be some human factor, I think, but I'm not super deep into that topic to be able to say too much more.
Maybe close on, is there anything that you would do differently if you could go back in time and talk to your, I don't know, 16 to 20-year-old self, besides avoid me and Dan in your general course of life? Yeah, are there any skills that you'd focus on differently? Are there any trends that maybe went a direction that you didn't foresee that you'd maybe change your mindset on? And maybe you can expand on that a bit.
Classic follow-up question.
Yeah, very, very classic.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think the mentorship is the biggest one for me. And that comes back to, I mean, that affects a lot of things. It affects your networking, as well as your personal growth and the direction of your career. There's a lot that you can gain from mentorship. And I think I was lucky enough to fall into that with the manager I mentioned at on Semi that kind of took me under his wing and took it upon himself to mentor me, maybe even against my will. But I think it's very important to seek that out and be proactive about it. Even today, I oftentimes forget about mentorship and have to kind of force myself to reach out and remind myself in the value in that. And every time I do, I'm always kind of floored and like, oh wow, that was really great. I don't know why I haven't done this in so long. So I think some companies you'll find are more proactive about that and will kind of force you to set up a mentor relationship with someone and your manager will tell you specifically, reach out to people. We need to find you a mentor and you need to write it down on some form of who that is or whatever. But even if that structure isn't in place or it's not required, I think it's very valuable and to reach out to people who are, either your role models or are in roles that you aspire to be in, or maybe you just want to learn more about, or even people who are, more junior than you and asking them for feedback on what you could do better. I think there's tons of value to be gained there. And I think it's largely on each person to pursue that. You can't really rely on someone else to force mentorship on you. So yeah, I think if I was to go back, that's something I would focus on more and do that more explicitly. And
yeah, that's a great one. I know personally, like in the past, I felt so stubborn, like I should just be able to figure this out myself. But you're still figuring it out yourself. You're just accelerating the process, I think. So
exactly, and yeah, that's his point. And I think you'll figure it out even without that, but it'll certainly take you longer, right?